Yeah. Are we okay? Yeah. Well, good evening and welcome to our Bible study here at Trinity. And as usual, a warm welcome if you're joining us online. This evening we are still in Matthew's Gospel. We're in chapter 5 and we will be starting at verse 25. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 25. If you remember last week we finished by talking about leaving your gift at the altar and going and making peace with your brother before you offer the gift. So verses 25 and 26. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still on the way with him, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. Okay, so Jesus is giving here a second example of earthly relationships. But instead of talking about sacrifices on the altar in the temple, he now shifts his attention to a legal setting in a courtroom. And in this example, it's not a brother, but an opponent at law who is the other person in this dispute. And the first example where Jesus says to leave our gift at the altar seems to concern our behavior within the church and our behavior as we approach God. If you like, quarrels and difficulties between believers. But here Jesus seems to be expanding our responsibilities regarding living peacefully to include everyone, believers and non-believers alike. And also in the first example, it seems to imply no sense of urgency. Just leave your gift at the altar and go and be reconciled with your brother before you come back and give the gift. But here, Jesus' instruction is very clear. He says, be reconciled with your adversary and do it quickly. There's a sense of urgency here. He tells the disciples to do it quickly while you're still on the way to court with him. The phrase, while you are still with him, incidentally, means right now. Absolutely right now, while you're still on the way. And on the way means obviously on the way to the trial or on your way to court. Jesus is saying here, there's a matter of urgency. Don't wait until later. Don't put it off. Don't wait until the trial. Do it now. Make restitution with your adversary with a sense of urgency while you are still on the way to court. It's interesting to note here as well, I don't know how many of you realize this or know it, but this very direction to settle matter with your adversary is found in Roman law. The Roman law of the 12 tables, which expressly directs the plaintiff and the defendant to make the matter up while they're still on the way or going to the praetor. Now, whether Jesus had this in mind when he said this, we don't know. We can never know. But it's just an interesting fact to remember that this was actually in Roman law as well. And don't forget, Roman laws, to some extent, prevailed in Palestine at the time because they were under Roman authority. The word adversary in this sentence, translated from the Greek word antidikos. In a legal context, it refers to the opponent or adversary in a lawsuit. Specifically, it describes the prosecuting attorney who argues a case in law against someone else. Now, when I first started reading this, it seemed a bit strange to me why two people who were against each other would be on their way to court together. It seemed rather improbable to me, but you know, in the ancient world it happened. And Barclay's Study Bible says this: under Greek law, there was a process of arrest called upagogy, which means summary arrest. In it, the plaintiff himself arrested the defendant. He caught him by the robe at his collar and his throat. And he held the robe in such a way so that if the man struggled, he'd be strangled. Obviously, these causes for which such an arrest was legal were very few, and the guy doing the wrong had to be caught red-handed. Barclay goes on to say, clearly, it is much more likely that Jesus would be thinking in terms of Jewish law. And this situation was by no means impossible either. This is obviously a case of debt, for if peace is not made, the last farthing will have to be paid. Such cases were settled by the local council of elders. A time was appointed when the plaintiff and the defendant had to appear together, and in any small town or village, there was every likelihood of them finding themselves on the way to this same meeting at the same time. Villages weren't very big. There weren't many people living there. There's not a lot of chance that you're going to be able to take a different route around. So when the man was adjudged guilty, he was handed over to the court officer. It was the duty of the court officer to see that the penalty was duly paid, and if it was not paid, he had the power to imprison the defaulter until it was paid. No doubt there's no doubt of that situation that Jesus was thinking about this, paying the last debt. Today we would tell people, I guess, don't borrow money in the first place and you won't end up in that trouble. But, this kind of thing, prevalent in Jesus' time, is getting worse because we live in a society today which is run by debt. It is very difficult to live today without being in debt. And so perhaps this advice becomes more and more relevant to us today than it was back in those days. It may have been a piece of practical advice. Again and again, we've all experienced it, I'm sure, in life, that if a quarrel or a difference or a dispute is not healed immediately, it can go on and on. It can brood, it can get worse. It builds up. Bitterness breeds bitterness. It's often happened that a quarrel between two people has descended down the family line. And then you fall out with somebody, you don't rectify it, you teach your kids to fall out with them. I saw it when I was out in Ireland with the army. I had kids like that throwing rocks at us as we went past, simply because they'd seen their fathers doing it. Fathers had taught their children to hate. This kind of thing goes on down the generations. And it has the result in the end of not only splitting families, but it can split churches as well. It can even split societies. So it's so important that we solve these matters quickly. It may be that Jesus had in mind there was something more ultimate than this. It may be that he is saying, put things right with your fellow man while life lasts. Because someday, you know not when, life will finish. And you will stand before God, the final judge of all. And so perhaps Jesus had in mind, put yourself right with God now, while you've got the chance. Don't put it off, because nobody is promised tomorrow. Now, you don't need me to tell you that the greatest of all Jewish days was the Day of Atonement. Its sacrifices were held to atone for sin, known and unknown. But even this day had its limitations. The Talmud clearly lays it down. The Day of Atonement does atone for the offenses between man and God. The Day of Atonement does not atone for offenses between man and his neighbor. Unless the man has first put things right with his neighbor. So here we are again. Put things right with your neighbor or your adversary. It doesn't matter who it is. If you've fallen out with somebody, put it right. And here again, what Jesus is alluding to is this basic fact that a man or a woman cannot be right with God unless you are right with your fellow man. A man must, or a woman must so live that the end will find him at peace with all men. He seems, I think, to be reinforcing what he said in the previous illustration, namely that ultimately we should love our neighbor as ourselves. And making an effort to resolve conflict and difficulties with others is part of the process. You don't fall out with people if you love them and keep it going. Sooner or later, and I know from experience, because I've fallen out with my wife quite a few times over the years, and it's usually me that ends up saying sorry. No, not really, but these things happen, don't they? You know, we all fall out. We all have difficulties. Put it right. Doesn't it say in the word, don't let the sun go down on your anger? So Jesus is making a big effort here to let us know that we need to put conflict right or avoid it in the first place. Because if you're living according to the precepts of God, love everybody as you love yourself, you should never fall out with people, really. Disagreements, yes, but you should never really fall out with anybody. Yep. No, that's right. Exactly. 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 Yes. Absolutely. There's always consequences. We talked about that in Ezekiel, didn't we? Yeah. Matthew Henry puts it like this. We ought to be careful to preserve Christian love and peace with all our brethren. And if at any time there is a quarrel, we should confess our fault, humble ourselves to our brother, making or offering satisfaction for wrong done in word or deed, and we should do it quickly, because till this is done, we are unfit for communion with God in holy ordinances. And that's something else that people don't think about. You cannot come to communion on a Sunday if you've got something against your brother, because that's the modern day equivalent of leaving your gift at the altar. Dr. Constable says this: the second illustration stresses the importance of making things right quickly. Two men walking together to the court where the disagreement would receive judicial arbitration should try to settle their grievances out of court. The offender should remove the occasion for the other man's anger and hatred quickly. Otherwise, the judge might make things difficult for both of them. The mention of going from judge to officer to prison pictures the red tape and complications involved in not settling out of court. Likewise, God will make it difficult for haters and those who provoke hate in others if they come before him with unresolved interpersonal disagreements. Malicious anger is evil, and God's judgment is certain. Therefore, disciples must do everything they can to end inappropriate anger quickly. Trouble is that goes against human nature. Really goes against human nature. Especially if that wrong involves physical violence. The natural reaction is physical violence back, but that's not the answer. And one thing we're not good at as well is admitting that we're wrong. You know, if we're honest, none of us like to say I was wrong. But it's what we're being called to do. And like Joe said, it's a good witness for somebody, because people will know you're a Christian, and they'll be watching you. And if they see that you're humble enough to stand up and say, you know what, I was wrong, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have done that, and I apologize. And it says in the word, it's amazing how a soft word turns away anger. You know, that simple, humble admission that I was wrong can get somebody from raging to calming down really, really quickly. So in summary, Matthew chapter 5 and 25 and 26 teaches us to seek reconciliation promptly and avoid severe consequences by making amends with those we've wronged. It's a call to critical self-analysis. It's a call to address disputes wisely and maintain goodwill with others. Romans 12:18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Okay, I'm going to read verses 27 and 28. You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So now, having addressed murder, Jesus is on adultery. And it's interesting to note, he starts this with the same sentence that he started his discourse on murder. "You have heard that it was said." Now, this isn't the same as "it is written," because Jesus is not quoting from the Old Testament, but from the teachings of the scribes and the Pharisees. He's not only reminding them what they already know, namely that according to the law, adultery is forbidden, but as in the case of murder, he takes it one step further. He says, "I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And you know, once again, we're back to the heart again, aren't we? The root cause of everything, what's going on in there, your attitudes and how you perceive people. Clark's commentary, "It is the earnest wish or desire of the soul, which, in a variety of cases, constitutes the good or evil of an act. If a man earnestly wishes to commit an evil but cannot, because God puts time, place, and opportunity out of his power, he is fully chargeable with the iniquity of the act, by that God who searches and judges the heart. So if a man earnestly wishes to do some kindness, which is out of his power to perform, the act is considered as his, because God, in this case, as in that above, takes the will for the deed. If voluntary and deliberate looks and desires make adulterers and adulteresses, how many persons there whose whole life is one continued crime?" So, in other words, if God is condemning us for the look, how many people on this planet are living in perpetual crime and sin? He goes on to say, "Whose eyes being full of adultery cannot cease from sin." Many would abhor to commit one external act before the eyes of men in a temple of stone, and yet they are not afraid to commit a multitude of such acts in the temple of their hearts and in the sight of God. Incidentally, the word translated lustfully is closely related to the word covet. So in other words, to look at somebody with lust is to want in some way, to own or to possess them. To lust after someone is to view them as an object that exists to meet your needs rather than as a person to respect and honor of one of God's very own children. So in other words, if you're looking at a woman lustfully, then you are turning that woman into an object, something for you to possess to gratify your needs. You're not looking at them any longer as a child of God. Commentary on the Bible, Contending for the Faith, says this: "Marriage is the most primary of all human relationships. Any sin that fractures the sanctity of this basic building block weakens the fabric of society and ultimately undermines the church. No sin is more devastating than adultery. Adultery destroys trust between husbands and wives. It subjects innocent children to grievous pain. It mocks the veracity of the marriage vow, and it destroys the symbolism of Jesus and the church. Scripture continuously speaks out against sexual immorality. It is so serious under the old law that it brings the immediate penalty of death. And if you want to look that up, it's in Leviticus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 22. The bottom line is, like murder, adultery is the end product of wrong thoughts and uncontrolled feelings. Adultery, like murder, is the end product of something that starts in the heart. Okay, verses 29 and 30. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Yeah, I had a problem with that one when I was growing up. I could never manage myself pulling an eye out or getting somebody to chop a hand off. You know, no. But you know, sorry? Well, people have done it before. What's that explorer name? Jane Randolph Fiennes? Got frostbite and cut his own fingers off in the garden shed. Think about it. The whole process of sinning goes something like this. The eye sees, the mind desires, and the body acts. So Jesus goes on in his teaching to involve the eyes and the hand, saying that if they cause sin, they should be plucked out or cut off. No, I could never get my hand around that one when I was a boy. It seemed a bit drastic to me. Mind you, I expect if I told my brother, will he pull my eye out, he probably would have done very happily on some occasions. And chop my hand off, yeah. But I could never quite convince myself that I'd allow it. I need them both, you know. Sometimes I struggle with only two, I could do it four. And I don't believe that Jesus meant this literally. And in a way, this highlights the very problem of reading the Bible without studying it. Because you can take things the wrong way if you don't take the time and trouble to look into what the original author was trying to say. And it can lead people to pulling eyes out and chopping their hands off for real. It's still law in some Islamic states. Yeah. Barnes, in his commentary, says this: it cannot be supposed that Christ intended this to be taken literally. His design was to teach that the dearest objects, if they cause us to sin, are to be abandoned. That by all sacrifices and self-denials, we must overcome the evil propensities of our nature and resist our wanton imaginations. Calvin says this: it might be thought that considering the weakness of the flesh and of nature, Christ pressed too severely on men, and therefore he anticipates all such complaints. The general meaning is that however difficult or severe or troublesome or harsh any command of God may be, yet no excuse ought to be pleaded on those grounds, because the justice of God ought to stand higher in our estimation than all that we reckon most precious and valuable. You have no right to object to me that you can scarcely turn your eyes in any direction without being suddenly drawn away by some temptation. For you ought rather to part with your eyes than to depart from the commands of God. And yet Christ does not mean that we must mutilate our body in order to obey God, but as we would all readily wish that they should not be restrained from the free use of their senses. Christ employs an exaggerated form of speech to show that whatever hinders us from yielding that obedience to God, which he requires in his law, should be cut off. And he does so expressly because men allow themselves too much liberty in that respect. If the mind were pure, the eyes and the hands would be obedient to it, for it is certain that they have no movement of their own. But here we are deeply to blame. We are so far from being as careful as we ought to be to avoid allurements that we rather provoke our senses to wickedness by allowing them unbounded liberty. Bit of a mouthful, all that. But basically, we're back to the heart again. If you keep your heart pure, then your hands and your eyes will follow. What Jesus is saying is that we should give up whatever causes us to temptation that leads us into sin. For example, if you can't resist watching programs that a Christian shouldn't be watching, get rid of your television. If Facebook causes people to covet other people's lifestyle and possessions, or to gossip, or to write spiteful comments, close your Facebook account down, get rid of it. Jesus is telling us not that we should pluck eyes and chop hands off, but that we should remove from our lives anything that causes us to sin, that leads us to temptation, which leads us on to sin. Removing the source of sin is always far better than trying to resist it. Because once temptation comes your way, you're more or less done for. It's far better to walk away from whatever causes you to sin in the first place and avoid temptation altogether. That's basically what Jesus is trying to say. And I think that's more relevant to us today because there's so much around to lead us into temptation, more than there was like even 100 years ago. All the television channels, the internet, exactly the internet, and things creep up on you. You mistype a search, and it's absolutely astonishing what comes up down your search engine. At the end of the day, I'm guilty. I'm an ex-soldier. I like watching war films, but I probably shouldn't be watching them because they're not good for a man of God to be watching people killing other people. Don't watch them. Get rid of your television if it's causing you a problem. Get rid of the internet if it's causing you a problem. It's far better to get rid of it and concentrate on being a faithful man or woman of God than to let yourself be dragged into these areas of temptation. Don't forget, the enemy knows your weaknesses probably better than you do. And you can bet your life he will hit you in the very place where you know you can't resist. And so the only way to combat it is to cut it off. Get rid of it. Whatever the cause of temptation is, get rid of it. Because the enemy then can't grab hold of you in that particular spot. And I think I'm going to call it a day there today. We've got to start a new heading now shortly, so we'll pick up on that next week.